Alright, so I have tallied the results, and by my calculations it looks like option A won, but like by 1 vote. Maybe 2 if I count Dragon. It was a really thin margin, and everyone's votes was split really evenly between all the choices. I'm going to take that as a compliment that I did well in my concepts and that they were all equally strong, lol. If this series is successful, maybe I'll bring back 1 or 2 of these concepts again. So for those of you with extremely short memories, like myself, option A is the demonic weapons world, and the most obviously fantasy, full of big monsters and dark items. I'm super excited. It's been a while since I've made a straight-up fantasy world with no major twists, so this'll be fun. Also, not gonna lie, fantasy worlds are often the most straightforward to construct. Now, when creating a world, you really have to start with the basics. The basics are a rather malleable term, and I'm going to be repeating myself a lot when I say that everyone does this differently. Typically, when I think about the basics of my world, I ask myself a couple of questions. 1, how big is the known world going to be? 2, what's the level of technology in this world / what technological aesthetic am I going for? And 3, what kind of people live in this world? I find that if you can answer those questions, a lot of the other bits of world building will fall into place far more easily. Starting with number 1, how big do I want this world to be? Now, keep in mind, I always go on the assumption that there's a whole planet out there, so if I end up having an idea that won't fit into my already existing world, I can just make a new continent. But it's always a good idea to have a starting point. Generally, I like to think of the known world as a single continent, but I think for this world, I'll make a small exception. If we're going to have huge beasts and quest for magic items, there's probably going to need to be a bunch of places to have these expeditions to. So, for now, let's say that there are 2 major continents, one where the majority of the civilized world lives, and one that's largely wilderness. I think we'll have the civilized continent be further north to be in a more temperate zone, and have the wild continent be further south, more jungly and humid. I'm going to rely on audience expectation here a little bit, because the vast majority of my viewers are probably going to live in a more temperate climate, and since popular culture has also taught us this, the jungle is an exotic locale. As sad as it is sometimes, I find that when making worlds, they become more believable the less you have to convince your audience of something. Making the temperate climate exotic is a harder sell than the other way around. Someday that might be a fun world to make. The civilized continent, I'd like to be more mountainous, a little rugged. It's a harsh environment, but that means that the demon beasties are probably a little less intense up there, since they'd have to survive the conditions as well, making it a little easier for ordinary people to survive. I've always liked the idea of crater continents, so I think that the wild continent should be a ring shape. Maybe there could be a fun arc demon in the middle of the bay or something. We'll come back to that. Before we move on, keep in mind that while I'm going to just make a lot of decisions on these episodes, if you have any additional things or details you think would be fun, feel free to leave a comment about it. So now that we've got the basics of the landmasses sorted, we'll move on to the second question, a question of technology. As a history buff, I tend to have a lot more specialized knowledge about various periods of history, but I have to keep in mind that most other people do not. So in breaking down the various levels of tech, we have a couple of broad categories to work with. First is the Ancient Bronze Age, which can range from nearly cavemen to Trojan War levels of tech, with more spears and shields and sword action. I think it would be fun to build a world like this someday, but if we're going to have demonic weapons, we're gonna need some swords. They did, of course, have swords, but they weren't really considered a primary weapon, so not today. We also have Higher Ancient, i.e. Ancient Greece and Rome, which advances the technology a little, but I feel like having a great empire on the map is going to make the monsters seem a little less intimidating than I want them to. Rome is too proud to get cowed by monsters, so for the sake of Windy Fields' pride, I'll put that aside as well. Next, we've got the Dark Ages, the early medieval stuff. Lots of castles, the feudal system was just getting going, but it's got a very apocalyptic feel to it. I gotta say that I'm liking certain elements of this. I think that having huge castles and stone defensive structures around most civilized areas would make sense in a world constantly in threat of being overrun. But I also want a little more diversity to work with when it comes to the magic items that can be created, and limiting myself to this exact time period seems kinda silly. But that's the fun thing about fantasy. As long as I can justify it, I can mix and match time periods to my whims. So, big defensive fortresses and maybe a basic feudal system are in, but let's keep going. I'm going to skip the High Medieval Ages, because most people just lump them together with the Dark Ages anyway, and go right on to the Renaissance. Now, this could be interesting. A slightly more advanced society that still relies on constructions of old to defend itself, while also aspiring to invent and create. The Renaissance was known as the rebirth of knowledge, when a much bigger emphasis was put on learning and becoming educated. This could create some fabulous tension between a society that yearns to grow and create but is constricted by the natural laws of their planet. A society that strives to kill all of the opposition but can't quite get the edge they need. I really like this. I like it a lot. So what we have so far is Dark Ages constructions and customs, but an actual level of tech that's seeking to stretch beyond that. Think like at the birth of the Renaissance. I like that a lot. There's one final question to answer though. Do we want these people to truly be inventing these things, or do we want them to be rediscovering tech left behind by someone else? As much as I know that the latter is way overdone, I'm a fucking sucker for ancient civilizations destroyed and leaving a pseudo-apocalypse in their wake. I don't think I'll answer this at the very moment, as I'll probably figure this out once we get to making a basic timeline, but it's something for everyone to begin pondering. So we'll move on to the final question. The people. We can tackle this question in several ways. In the past, I've mostly stuck to humans and focused on the different countries and how they conflict with each other, but since society will be slightly more contained than most worlds I've built, since travel will be much more dangerous, I think an easier division will be one more of races. It won't be a hard division, and I'll still have a couple of different kingdoms, etc., but it's a good place to start. Unfortunately, I am literally sick to death of your typical fantasy races. I don't want any elves, and I don't want any dwarves, and no halflings or gnomes either. I also don't want cat people, which are always the first alternative to the aforementioned heavy hitters. So, this is where you all come in. I'm thinking of including humans, plus probably about 2 other races. So I'm going to open up the floor to you guys. What would be a fun race to include in this world? I'll probably take one of your suggestions and then put in one of my own as well. But if there's 2 really great ones from you guys, I could go with that as well. I'm super excited to see what you come up with, and if you find yourself stuck, I always find a good place to start is looking on D&D homebrew forums because they have races up the wazoo. I'll see you all next week, and very pumped to see what you come up with. Have fun!